The Gimmonis. University denied my funding, then the audit began.
Everyone thinks the breaking point is the rejection. The letter. The closed door. The polite apology wrapped in institutional language. But that's not where the story actually begins. The real beginning is the moment you realize the system expects your silence more than your compliance. It expects you to absorb the damage, to translate humiliation into gratitude, and to disappear without causing friction. This is a story about that moment. When the room is quiet, when the authority figure is already mentally moving on to lunch, and when the decision has been framed as inevitable. It's about understanding that power doesn't always announce itself with force. Sometimes it arrives embossed in gold, citing clauses no one thinks you'll read. And it's about what happens when someone does read them. When expertise shifts from performance to strategy. When survival turns into calculation. Because institutions aren't dismantled by outrage. They're dismantled by people who know the rules better than the ones breaking them, and who understand that the most destabilizing response isn't anger or tears, but calm, informed refusal. This is the story of how silence, used deliberately, becomes the opening move in a legal, procedural reckoning. The clock on the wall was a grand antique thing, a pendulum swinging inside a coffin of walnut wood, slicing the silence into digestible seconds of humiliation. I sat there, my hands folded deliberately in my lap, watching the dean's fingers trace the edge of the document he had just slid across the desk. It was a rejection letter, but it was dressed up in the polite, suffocating language of academia. He didn't say get out. He said unfortunately, due to unforeseen reallocation of departmental assets, the merit-based grant you were assured of is no longer available for the upcoming semester. The air in the office tasted like old leather and furniture polish, a scent designed to intimidate, to remind you that this institution had stood for 200 years and you were just a temporary glitch in its ledger. I watched a dust mote float through a shaft of sunlight that cut across the room, landing softly on the shoulder of his expensive tweed jacket. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at a spot somewhere past my left ear, perhaps focusing on the spine of a leather-bound book on the shelf behind me, avoiding the reality of what he was actually doing. This was the moment of impact, the car crash in slow motion where the metal screams and the glass shatters. But here, in the hallowed halls of higher education, violence is done with paper and quiet apologies. I could feel the texture of the chair beneath me, the cold brass tacks digging slightly into my back, grounding me in a reality I desperately wanted to reject. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a trapped bird in a cage of bone, but I forced my face to remain a mask of impassive calm. This is the first rule of survival they don't teach you in orientation, but you learn through osmosis when you look like me in a place like this. You never let them see the bleed. If you show anger, you validate their bias. If you show tears, you validate their pity. So you become a statue. You become the marble bust in the hallway, cold and impenetrable. I looked at the letter again. The university seal at the top was embossed in gold, catching the light, a shining symbol of the gatekeeping that was currently taking place. 3 years of perfect grades. 3 years of being the first one in the library and the last one out. 3 years of swallowing microaggressions like bitter pills and smiling through the indigestion. And it all came down to a signature on a piece of cream-colored cardstock that effectively erased my future. The dean finally cleared his throat, a wet, nervous sound that betrayed his composure. He adjusted his glasses, pushing them up the bridge of his nose, and tapped the paper. He spoke about budget cuts and administrative restructuring, using words that were meant to be shields, deflecting responsibility away from the human decision to cut funding for the only student in the department who relied on it to eat. I listened to the cadence of his voice, the way it dipped at the end of sentences, turning statements into questions, seeking my absolution. He wanted me to nod. He wanted me to say I understood. He wanted me to make this easy for him so he could go to his lunch at the faculty club with a clear conscience. But I didn't nod. I didn't speak. I just watched him. And in that silence, I saw something shift in his eyes. He wasn't just dismissing a student, he was hoping I would disappear. He was banking on the assumption that I didn't know the bylaws, that I hadn't memorized the student handbook, that I was just grateful to be in the room at all. That was his mistake. He saw a scholarship kid. I saw a breach of contract. The room felt smaller now, the high ceilings pressing down, the portraits of dead benefactors staring from the walls with judgment. I focused on the specific clause 4, section B mentioned in the denial letter. My mind raced back to the orientation packet I had received freshman year, the one I had kept in a plastic bin under my bed. I remembered the phrasing differently. I remembered a promise. The silence stretched out, becoming a physical weight in the room, heavy and awkward. The dean shifted in his seat, the leather creaking loudly, betraying his discomfort. He expected an outburst. He expected begging. He was prepared for emotion. He was utterly unprepared for calculation. I took a slow breath, inhaling the scent of old paper and institutional arrogance. I reached out, my hand steady, and picked up the letter. I didn't crumble it. I didn't throw it. I folded it precisely in half, creasing the edge with my thumb until it was sharp enough to cut. I placed it in my bag, the sound of the zipper closing echoing like a gavel strike in the quiet office. When I finally looked him in the eye, I didn't see a superior. I saw a liability. I stood up, smoothing the front of my thrifted blazer, and saw the confusion ripple across his face. I was supposed to be devastated. Instead, I was mobilized. I walked to the door, my footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug, and paused with my hand on the brass knob. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't thank him. I simply opened the door and walked out into the corridor, the sudden noise of the bustling university hallway hitting me like a wave. But as I walked away from that office, the devastation began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They thought they had closed a door. What they had actually done was hand me the key to burn the whole house down, legally, procedurally, and absolutely. The audit didn't start with a team of accountants. It started right there, with the silence I left behind in that room. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, severing the air-conditioned silence of the administration wing from the humid, chaotic reality of the student union corridor. I stood there for a moment, the brass nameplate of the dean's office still visible in my peripheral vision, shining with a pretentious luster that seemed to mock the conversation which had just transpired. I needed to move, to put physical distance between myself and the patronizing sympathy that had filled that room. The walk across the quadrangle was usually a time for decompression, but today the manicured lawns and neo-Gothic arches looked different. They looked like stage sets designed to intimidate, built to remind anyone without a legacy surname that they were merely guests in a house owned by history. I watched a group of undergraduates laughing near the fountain, their biggest worry likely a forgotten textbook or a looming mixer, and the invisible wall between their experience and mine felt miles thick. For them, the university was a playground of discovery. For me, the geography of this campus had transformed into a minefield of unwritten rules and shifting expectations, where a single misstep could result in the revocation of my future. I found my way to the brutalist concrete steps of the graduate library, a place where sunlight struggled to penetrate the gray slabs, matching the somber, steel-gray hue of my thoughts. Sitting there, the stone rough and cold beneath me, I pulled the rejection letter from my bag. It was the physical manifestation of the conversation I had just survived. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, textured with a watermark of the university crest that caught the light. Even their rejections were expensive. This is the essence of what we call the black tax. It is not merely a financial deficit, though the funding denial was certainly a fiscal catastrophe. It is the psychological surcharge levied on every interaction, every ambition, and every mistake. It is the requirement to be exceptional just to be considered average, and the exhaustion that comes from navigating a system that demands your gratitude while actively dismantling your prospects. The dean had spoken about budget cuts and allocation committees with a practiced smoothness, but his eyes had told a different story. They spoke of a presumption of incompetence, a subtle, ingrained disbelief that someone like me could truly belong in the upper echelons of academia without a handout. He didn't see a scholar with potential, he saw a charity case that had become too demanding. Most people crumble under this tax because it is designed to be crushing. They internalize the rejection, believing the insidious lie that they are insufficient, that the error lies in their own capabilities rather than the system's design. They fade away, quiet and resentful, becoming ghost stories whispered by the next generation. But I had been raised in a different school of thought. My grandfather, a man who navigated the Jim Crow South with a spine of steel, used to say that when the world refuses to give you what you earned, you do not beg, you account. You tally the books. The black tax is designed to bankrupt the spirit, to exhaust you into submission so that you leave voluntarily, saving them the trouble of removing you. I realized then, watching the shadows lengthen across the plaza, that my survival depended on rejecting the emotional currency they were trying to force on me. I would not pay in shame. I would not pay in anger. I would pay in receipts. The audit I planned to launch was not just about the tuition waiver or the research grant. Those were merely the stakes. The game itself was an audit of their integrity, a forensic examination of their own stated values versus their actions. To understand how I dismantled a century-old institution's discriminatory funding policy, you have to understand three critical lessons I learned in the trenches of this academic war, lessons that became the pillars of my counter-narrative. These aren't just strategies for survival, they are weapons of bureaucratic warfare. First, there is the defense of excellence, the armor that makes you untouchable and forces them to invent reasons for denial that inevitably contradict their own bylaws. Second, the art of strategic code switching, which is not about changing who you are to please them, but about speaking the dialect of power better than the natives, using their own policy language to trap them in logical corners. And finally, the law of receipts, the understanding that in a world of vague denials and handshake agreements, documentation is the only god that matters. The wind picked up, scattering dry leaves across the concrete steps, the sound like whispering paper. I looked at the library tower, looming above me. It was a repository of knowledge, but also a fortress of gatekeeping. I thought about the thousands of students before me who had hit this same wall and turned back. The weight of their unfulfilled potential pressed on my shoulders, not as a burden, but as a mandate. This wasn't just my fight. The dean had made a tactical error. He assumed my silence in his office was submission. He didn't know that I was merely gathering data. I was observing the tilt of his head, the nervous tap of his pen, the way he avoided direct eye contact when mentioning the specific bylaws. I took out a notebook. Not a laptop, but a simple, bound notebook. I opened a fresh page. At the top, I didn't write a frantic diary entry. I wrote a date. I wrote a time. I wrote the specific phrase the dean had used regarding a lack of alignment with departmental priorities. I stared at those words until they ceased to be hurtful and became evidence. This was the beginning of the counter-narrative. The tension in my chest, the tightness that comes from holding back a scream, began to coil into something useful. It became a spring. The black tax tries to make us feel like we are always in debt to the system. I was about to prove that the system was actually in debt to me. The audit was open. The fluorescent hum of the graduate student lounge at 3 a.m. is a sound that vibrates in the teeth, a relentless electrical drone that serves as the soundtrack to overachievement. I sat alone at the long oak table, the surface scarred by generations of students who had carved their anxieties into the wood with ballpoint pens and compass tips. Around me, the shadows of the empty university felt heavy, pressing against the windows like a physical weight. This was the sanctuary of the invisible work, the place where the defense of excellence was constructed brick by painful brick. In the wake of the dean's rejection, I did not go to the bar to drown my sorrows, nor did I retreat to my dormitory to weep into a pillow. I went to work. The defense of excellence is a survival mechanism ingrained in the psyche of every black student who has dared to enter a space not built for them. It is the understanding that while mediocrity is a luxury afforded to the majority, perfection is the baseline tariff for our entry. I laid out my denied grant proposal on the left side of the table and the university's scoring rubric on the right. I became a forensic accountant of my own intellect. I began to dismantle my own work with a cold, clinical detachment. I checked every citation, tracing the lineage of my arguments back to primary sources, hunting for a weakness, a loose thread, a single misplaced comma that they could have used to justify the denial. I needed to know if I had failed, or if I had been failed. As I read through my proposal, a strange sensation washed over me, a mixture of relief and a simmering, cold fury. The work was impeccable. It was not merely adequate, it was dense, innovative, and rigorously researched. I compared my methodology to the successful proposals of previous years, documents I had pulled from the public archives. The contrast was stark. Where my peers offered vague hypotheses and tentative connections, my proposal offered concrete data models and actionable outcomes. I realized then that my excellence was not a shield against racism, it was the very thing that had provoked it. To be undeniably good is to threaten the hierarchy that relies on your alleged inferiority. I looked at the stack of papers, the red ink of my own revisions bleeding into the margins. This is the burden of the defense. You must be twice as good to get half as far, a cliché that is repeated so often it has lost its stinging truth, but in that silent room, the math of it was deafening. I thought about the weekends I spent in the library while my cohort, students like Julian and Sarah, spent their time networking at faculty mixers. They played the game of social capital. I played the game of irrefutable competence. I had believed that if I built a fortress of high grades, published papers, and glowing student evaluations, I would be safe. I thought excellence was a currency that could buy dignity. But looking at the rejection letter, I understood that to the administration, my excellence was a form of inflation they refused to recognize. They wanted to devalue the currency before it could be spent. The silence of the room was broken only by the turning of pages. I moved from my grant proposal to my transcripts, and then to my teaching evaluations. I began to compile a dossier. This was no longer about a single funding request. It was about building a composite image of a scholar who could not be dismissed on professional grounds. I read the comments from my undergraduate students, notes praising the clarity of my lectures and the depth of my feedback. I looked at the departmental awards I had won in my first year, the ones that came with certificates but no money. I arranged them in a timeline. This was the counter-story. The official narrative was that I was a struggling student who failed to align with departmental priorities. The counter-narrative, comprised of hard data and documented success, was that I was a rising star being suffocated by a system that preferred its stars to look a certain way. Excellence, I realized as the sun began to bleed a pale gray light through the eastern windows, is a lonely place. It isolates you. It forces you to internalize a standard of perfection that is unsustainable for a human being. It turns you into a machine of production, constantly outputting value to justify your existence. But in this moment, that machine was my greatest asset. They had made a mistake. They had assumed I would accept the denial as a judgment on my quality. They had counted on my insecurity. But by forcing me to audit myself, they had inadvertently forced me to recognize my own power. I stacked the papers into a neat pile. The edges were sharp. The defense of excellence was complete. I was not going into that audit asking for a favor. I was going in to present a bill for services rendered. The sun finally broke the horizon, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, and for the first time in days, I didn't feel the crushing weight of the black tax. I felt the dangerous clarity of someone who knows exactly what they are worth, and exactly who owes them. The fluorescent lights of the third-floor administrative restroom hummed with a low, electric anxiety that seemed to match the frequency vibrating in my chest. I stood before the industrial sink, watching the cold water swirl down the drain, delaying the moment when I would have to look up and confront my own reflection. This space, with its beige tiles and smell of antiseptic soap, was the decontamination chamber between the world of my reality and the world of the university's bureaucracy. Before I could walk into the dean's office with the evidence I had spent the night compiling, I had to undergo a transformation that every black student in a predominantly white institution knows intimately. I had to locate the internal volume knob and adjust the settings of my humanity to a frequency that the administration could tolerate. This is the invisible labor that never appears on a transcript or a tuition bill. It is the psychological calibration required to enter a room where your presence is already a question mark and your ambition is often interpreted as aggression. I turned off the faucet, the sudden silence crashing into the room, and finally lifted my eyes to the mirror. The face looking back at me was tired, etched with the sleeplessness of the previous night's frantic auditing, but the eyes needed to be different. They could not show fear, for fear attracts predators in administrative clothing. Nor could they show anger, despite the righteous fury burning in my gut over the funding denial. In this environment, a black student's anger is weaponized against them, treated not as a valid response to injustice but as a defect of character. If I walked into that office radiating the heat of my frustration, the narrative would instantly shift from the university's accounting error to my behavioral problem. I had to perform a delicate act of emotional engineering. I imagined a mixing board behind my eyes, the kind used in recording studios, with sliders for tone, volume, diction, and posture. I began to slide the faders. I dialed down the urban frequency, the cadence of my neighborhood, the warmth of my vernacular, until it was completely muted. I dialed up the hyper-articulate academic, pushing the levels of vocabulary and passive voice until they clipped into the red zone. This modulation is what sociologists call code switching, but that term feels too benign, too effortless. It implies simply changing languages, like swapping French for Spanish. What I was doing in that mirror was far more visceral. I was surgically removing parts of my identity to fit through the narrow door of institutional acceptability. I smoothed the lapel of my jacket, checking for any lint that might be interpreted as sloppiness. In the logic of the black tax, being disheveled is a privilege reserved for the tenured geniuses and the wealthy legacies. For me, a wrinkle in a shirt could be read as a wrinkle in my discipline, a lack of preparation, a reason to deny the funding. The standard of excellence requires not just intellectual perfection, but aesthetic armor. I practiced my opening greeting in the silence of the bathroom. "Good morning, Dean. Thank you for making the time." I repeated it, flattening the vowels, removing the bass, making myself sound harmless, grateful, and inevitably correct. It is a strange dissonance, preparing to fight a war while practicing the etiquette of a tea party. The most dangerous setting on the internal volume knob is the one that controls confidence. If the volume is too low, you are dismissed as incompetent, a diversity hire struggling to keep up with the rigorous demands of the program. They will look at you with pity and offer resources that are really just off-ramps from success. But if the volume is too high, if you walk in knowing exactly how good you are and demanding what you are owed, you trip the alarm sensors. You become arrogant, difficult, or uncooperative. You threaten the hierarchy. The sweet spot is a razor-thin frequency of quietly competent. You must appear excellent but surprised by your own excellence, brilliant but deferential to their authority. You have to hand them the answer while making them feel like they discovered it. I watched my reflection settle into this mask. The jaw relaxed, the brow unfurrowed, the eyes softened into a look of polite inquiry. The warrior who had spent all night organizing receipts and highlighting discrepancies was still there, but he was now hidden inside a Trojan horse of perfectly tailored deference. I picked up the leather portfolio containing the defense of excellence. It felt heavier now, not just with paper, but with the weight of the performance I was about to give. The irony was suffocating. I was about to walk into an office to prove that I belonged in this institution, yet to do so, I had to suppress the very attributes that made me who I was. I had to become a mirror that reflected their own expectations back at them, a version of a black student that comforted their biases rather than challenging them. But as I reached for the door handle, the cold steel grounding me, I realized that this modulation was not a surrender. It was camouflage. It was tactical. I wasn't changing who I was to please them, I was changing how I appeared to outmaneuver them. I was lowering the volume of my identity so that they would be forced to hear the deafening volume of my data. I took a deep breath, inhaling the sterile air, and opened the door. The hallway stretched out before me, long and polished, leading to the glass doors of the administration. I stepped out, the mask firmly in place, ready to play their game better than they ever imagined. The scent of Dr. Vance's office was a distinct composition of mahogany shavings and decomposing vellum, a sharp departure from the antiseptic bleach and ozone that permeated the administrative wing I had just fled. This room was a sanctuary of brown and gold, where the afternoon light filtered through dust motes that seemed to hang suspended in time, oblivious to the frantic urgency of the academic calendar. I sat in a leather chair that had likely held 3 generations of students before me, the cracked material groaning softly as I shifted my weight, trying to find a posture that didn't betray the trembling in my hands. Across the desk, Dr. Vance did not look up immediately. He was carefully polishing his spectacles with a microfiber cloth, his movements deliberate and rhythmic, a metronome slowing the erratic tempo of my own heart. I placed the rejection letter on the chaotic stack of papers between us. The document felt heavy, not in ounces, but in implications, a tangible anchor threatening to drag my entire future into the abyss of statistical probability. I waited for him to read it, to gasp, to share in my indignation. But he simply placed his glasses back on the bridge of his nose and looked at the letter with the dispassionate gaze of a coroner examining a familiar cause of death. He didn't need to read the text to know what it said. He knew the dialect of bureaucracy fluently, having survived its polite violence for 40 years. When he finally spoke, his voice was a deep rumble that seemed to emanate from the bookshelves themselves. He told me that I was looking at a denial of funds, but he was looking at a ritual. This was the moment the narrative pivoted from a simple administrative grievance to a profound lesson in intergenerational survival. He leaned forward, clasping his hands, and explained that institutions do not have feelings, but they do have memories, encoded in bylaws and budget committees. He asked me if I thought I was the first brilliant black student to suddenly find the well dry when it mattered most. It was a rhetorical question that hung in the air like smoke. Dr. Vance began to recount a story from the late 70s, a time when the hostility was less coded but equally effective. He spoke of a grant he had won and then lost on a technicality, a missing signature that never existed. The pain in his voice had long since calcified into wisdom. He explained that the system counts on our fatigue. It relies on the assumption that the emotional tax of fighting for what is rightfully ours will eventually bankrupt our spirit. This was the black tax in its most insidious form, not just the financial burden of supporting others, but the psychological toll of having to constantly relitigate one's own worthiness to exist in these spaces. I listened, and as I did, the walls of the room seemed to dissolve, revealing a long line of scholars standing behind him, shadowy figures who had faced closed doors and glass ceilings, who had swallowed their pride so that I could sit in this chair and feel this anger. I realized then that my individual crisis was merely the latest stanza in an epic poem of resistance. The rejection letter was not a verdict on my capability, it was a test of my stamina. Dr. Vance stood up and walked to a filing cabinet that looked as if it hadn't been opened since the Berlin Wall fell. The metal screeched in protest as he yanked a drawer open. He pulled out a faded green ledger and tossed it onto the desk next to my pristine, laser-printed rejection. He told me that anger is a gasoline that burns out quickly, but data is a nuclear fuel that burns forever. He wasn't just my professor in that moment, he was a general handing a map to a lieutenant. He explained that to win, I had to stop thinking like a student begging for a favor and start thinking like an auditor looking for a discrepancy. The university, he said, operates on the assumption that students are transient, that we leave before we can understand the machinery. But he had stayed. He had watched, and he knew where the bodies were buried, or rather, where the funds were diverted. He looked me in the eye, his gaze piercing through the layer of modulation I had built up in the hallway, and told me that the only way to honor the lineage of those who came before was to refuse to accept the silence. The receipts, he whispered, were not just pieces of paper. They were weapons. As I took the ledger, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The office was no longer a dusty archive of the past, it was the war room for the future. I wasn't alone in this fight. I had the ghosts of the denied standing at my shoulder, and for the first time since opening that letter, I didn't feel desperate. I felt dangerous. The rain slashed against the narrow window of my dormitory room, creating a rhythmic isolation that felt entirely appropriate for the forensic excavation I was undertaking. It was 3 a.m, and the world outside had reduced itself to the sweeping headlights of passing cars and the hum of the refrigerator. But inside the perimeter of my desk, a war was being waged in silence. The ledger the older professor had handed me was not merely a book of accounts. It was a cartography of systemic neglect. I had spent the last 6 hours cross-referencing the rejection letter I received with the public financial disclosures the university was legally required to publish, alongside the private departmental memos the mentor had slipped into my hand. The counter-storytelling framework requires us to reject the premise that we are denied resources because of scarcity. Scarcity is often a myth constructed to justify exclusion. As I ran my finger down the columns of the fiscal year spreadsheet, the myth began to unravel, thread by thread. The funding for the minority scholarship program hadn't evaporated into the ether of a bad economy. It had been reallocated. Specifically, I traced the movement of $50,000, the exact sum of the grant pool I had been told was empty, moved 3 weeks prior into a discretionary fund for administrative office renovations. The cruelty of it was breathtaking in its banality. They weren't saving the university from financial ruin. They were buying mahogany desks and ergonomic chairs with the tuition of students they deemed statistically insignificant. There is a specific kind of coldness that settles in the chest when you realize your failure was manufactured by someone else's comfort. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I built a dossier. I treated my own life, my own academic future, as a case study. I organized the emails where I was told to wait, the dates of the funding transfers, and the bylaws of the university charter which explicitly stated that donor-restricted funds could not be repurposed for capital improvements. This was the receipt. In the colloquial sense, having the receipts means having the proof to win an argument, but in this institutional context, it meant holding the mirrored glass up to the administration so they could see the ugliness of their own bureaucracy. I printed everything in triplicate. I put on my best suit, the one I had bought for interviews I was now in danger of missing, and I walked across the campus as the sun began to rise. The morning mist clung to the Gothic architecture, giving the university an ethereal, timeless quality that usually made me feel small. Today, however, the buildings looked like nothing more than piles of stone bought with blood money. I felt a terrifying clarity. I wasn't going there to beg for a second chance. I was going there to offer them a settlement. The assistant at the dean's office tried to stop me, citing schedules and appointments, but the dossier under my arm and the unwavering fixity of my gaze suggested that I was not a student having a crisis, but an auditor arriving for a reckoning. When I walked into the office, the dean looked up with that familiar, practiced expression of weary patience, the look reserved for scholarship cases who just couldn't understand the complexities of high-level administration. He gestured for me to sit, ready to launch into his monologue about limited resources and resilience. I did not sit. I placed the binder on his desk. It landed with a heavy, dull thud that seemed to suck the air out of the room. I opened it to page 4, where the transfer of funds was highlighted in neon yellow. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't speak about my dreams or my grandmother's sacrifices or the unfairness of the world. I spoke about Article 4, Section C of the donor agreement. I spoke about the legal implications of misappropriating restricted endowments. I spoke the language of liability. The transformation in the room was chemical. The dean's posture shifted from paternalistic relaxation to rigid alertness. He reached for his glasses, sliding them onto his nose as he pulled the binder closer. I watched his eyes scan the lines I had highlighted. I saw the moment the realization hit him, not that he had done something wrong, but that he had been caught by someone he underestimated. The silence that stretched between us was heavy with the shifting of power. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time. He didn't see a charity case anymore. He saw a threat. He cleared his throat, the sound dry and brittle in the quiet office. He began to talk about administrative errors, about clerical mix-ups, about how complex the accounting software could be. I let him talk. I let him spin the web of excuses because every word he said confirmed that I had won. I didn't need him to admit guilt, I only needed him to fix it. When he finally stopped, breathless and slightly flushed, I simply asked when the error would be corrected. He picked up his phone, his hand trembling slightly, and dialed the bursar. He didn't ask if there was money available. He demanded that a check be cut immediately. As I walked out of that office, I didn't feel elation. I felt a profound, exhausting validation. The moral victory wasn't just in getting the money. It was in forcing the institution to break its own character, to drop the mask of benevolent authority and reveal the transactional machine underneath. I had the receipts, and for once, the transaction was settled in my favor. The sunlight on graduation day possessed a relentless, clarifying quality that seemed to bleach the color out of the manicured lawns and the red brick facades of the campus buildings. I sat in a folding chair that felt too small for the magnitude of the moment, surrounded by a sea of black polyester gowns that absorbed the midday heat until we were all sweating in unison. This was the ceremony of inclusion, the ritual where the institution ostensibly hugged us close and called us its own, yet my mind was drifting away from the pomp and circumstance toward the silence of the archives I had built in my dormitory room. When they called my name, the sound did not echo with the triumph of a battle won, but rather with the dull thud of a ledger finally being closed. I stood up, the weight of the academic hood heavy against my throat, and began the long walk toward the stage. This was the victory lap, yet I felt less like a champion and more like a survivor of a shipwreck who had managed to swim to shore while clutching the ship's logbook. As I crossed the wooden platform, I saw him. The administrator, the man who had sat behind the mahogany desk and told me that the funds did not exist, was seated in the second row of the faculty section. He was clapping. His applause was polite, rhythmic, and entirely devoid of recognition. He did not remember me. To him, our confrontation was just another Tuesday, another bureaucratic snag that had been smoothed over and forgotten. To me, it was the defining architecture of my education. I realized then that his amnesia was a privilege. He was allowed to forget the errors of the system because the system was designed to protect him from their consequences. I, however, had to remember every detail, every email timestamp, and every policy subsection just to survive. This was the final lesson, the one that wasn't listed on the syllabus but was required for graduation nonetheless. The lesson was that the black tax is not merely financial. It is an emotional and cognitive tax. It is the bandwidth you must dedicate to auditing your own existence because you cannot trust the institution to count you correctly. I accepted the diploma with a firm grip, feeling the texture of the heavy cardstock, and looked out at the audience. Somewhere in that crowd were my parents, who believed that hard work alone was the currency of success. I would never have the heart to tell them that hard work is merely the ante to sit at the table. The real game is played with receipts. As I returned to my seat, the adrenaline of the fight finally began to drain away, leaving behind a profound, crystalline clarity. I understood now that the university was not a temple of wisdom but a machine of maintenance. It sought to maintain its endowment, its reputation, and its status quo. My presence, and the funding required to sustain it, had been viewed as a glitch in that maintenance. By forcing the audit, I had not just fixed a clerical error, I had reprogrammed a small section of the machine to recognize me as essential code rather than malware. The ceremony dragged on, a parade of names and accolades, but I was no longer listening. I was thinking about the concept of the open loop. 4 months, that unpaid tuition bill had been an open loop in my mind, a draining background process that slowed down every other thought. Now, the loop was closed. The check had cleared. The account was settled. But the scar tissue remained. This is the part of the story that counter-storytelling seeks to illuminate. The traditional narrative would paint this moment as pure jubilation, a cinematic freeze frame of a mortarboard hat thrown in the air. The counter-narrative reveals the exhaustion that lies beneath the smile. It acknowledges that while I secured the funding, I lost hours of sleep, days of study, and a significant portion of my youthful idealism. I had learned to become a lawyer, an accountant, and a private investigator for my own life, all while studying for a degree in a completely different field. When the ceremony ended, I walked to the edge of the campus, where the manicured grass met the city pavement. I turned back one last time to look at the administration building. It looked smaller now. It was no longer a fortress of insurmountable authority. It was just a building full of people who were tired, sloppy, and prone to mistakes. I had demystified the wizard. I touched the pocket of my gown where I had instinctively tucked the graduation program, saving it as proof that this day had actually happened. The habit of collecting evidence would likely never leave me. I turned my back on the ivory tower and stepped onto the sidewalk. I was debt-free, Not because they were generous, but because I was diligent. I carried my degree in one hand and my dignity in the other, and as I walked away, I realized that the latter was the heavier, more valuable burden to bear. The audit was over. The books were balanced. I was free.